I'm going to start my study time. There is my gym box. I'm gonna start now.
Today I'm going to discuss baseline logic and steady state responding. There are a couple of videos in this module that cover the same topic in different ways, and that's because this is really an important concept to master, and having multiple exposures using multiple exemplars can only help you to master the content. I'd like to point out that many of the slides in this presentation are adapted from the Cooper, Heron, and Hayward book. I think that they did a really nice job of explaining steady state strategy and providing visuals to support. So many of the slides use content from the chapter on single case research design in this textbook. The steady state strategy forms the basis of baseline logic. You already know that repeated measurement is a key feature of single case research design. So we're going to repeatedly expose a given subject to a given condition in order to determine whether or not a functional relationship exists. All the while, we want to eliminate or control for extraneous influences on behavior, so other things that might be contributing to the effects that we're observing. Some of the common threats to internal validity or extraneous variables that might influence behavior are, for example, history and maturation. You covered these a little bit in a little bit more detail in an earlier chapter, so it's good to be aware of some of these issues. We want to make sure that we have steady state responding. This assumes that we've obtained a stable pattern of responding before introducing the next condition, and only when we have stability can we be more certain in our results. When possible, we should always collect baseline data. There are some instances when it's not possible to collect baseline data. So, for example, that there might be situations where there's an ethical concern with delaying treatment, such as if an individual is engaging in severe self-injurious behavior. There might also be situations when an intervention has already started and we don't want to withdraw that, but we still want to evaluate whether or not another intervention or adding a component helps to change behavior. In single case research design, we often use an ABC notation. Using this notation, which is different from ABC data collection that you learned about in 609, so where you look at the antecedents, the behaviors, and the consequences. In single case research design, the A typically represents baseline, the baseline phase, and B, C, D, and so on and so forth represent different independent variables. Keep in mind that baseline isn't necessarily a time when there's no treatment, but rather it represents the absence of a specific independent variable. Baseline in single case research design is going to serve as your control condition, and it allows us to predict what might happen if the independent variable was not implemented. It also helps us to detect whether or not there was a change in behavior following implementation of the independent variable, and then if this change was meaningful or clinically significant. There are also some applied benefits of collecting baseline data. So, for one, we can obtain descriptions of the antecedent behavior and consequent correlations for planning effective treatment. So, say I'm collecting baseline data, I might learn that Kara is more likely to bite her hands when presented with a specific test demand. And this can help me to try out different interventions or to identify intervention components that are likely to be effective for Kara. Baseline data can also be helpful in setting an initial criteria for reinforcement. I was just consulting for a case of a 5-year-old who had difficulty sitting at the table for work time. And so I wanted to know a baseline level of how long he can sit and work on a task before he gets up. And this will allow me to shape his intervention and set up the most appropriate schedule of reinforcement. Another important reason why we collect baseline data is because it might show us that an intervention isn't warranted. So, for example, if the client's improving during baseline, I wouldn't implement an intervention because they might continue on
Mhm.
improving in the absence of an intervention. I recently saw this happen with a child who engaged in a lot of vocal stereotypy. He wound up decreasing the vocal stereotypy just over time, and so an intervention or complicated intervention wasn't needed.
Mhm.
There are several common patterns of responding that we might see during baseline. For example, graph A shows us a stable baseline and a steady state. This is the ideal case and will help us in prediction and verification and affirmation. B shows us an increasing trend, and panel C shows us a decreasing trend.
Mhm.
If there is a trend during baseline in the direction that we would expect if the intervention was implemented, we might not implement an intervention because the client's already improving. Graph D shows variability in responding. Notice that these data are sort of all over the place. Excel would allow you to plot a trend line and it would likely to be decreasing, but you should be pretty cautious when making decisions given the variability in these data. Baseline logic involves the concepts of prediction, affirmation, verification, and replication. And we'll talk about each of these in a little bit more detail.
There goes my inbox.